Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving deep into analgesic drugs, and the scope of this topic is, well, it's staggering.
It really is.
If you're practicing in Canada, pain management is foundational because the sources confirm pain is the central issue driving 78% of all emergency department visits annually.
Yeah, that number really hits home. It shows just how critical, effective, safe pharmacology is.
Absolutely.
It absolutely sets the stage. Our mission in this deep dive is to uh, quickly distill the complex pharmacological approaches to pain management
Yeah.
laid out in this chapter,
Right.
focusing specifically on the key drug classes, their mechanisms, and, importantly, the crucial nursing considerations that, turn theory into safe clinical practice.
Okay, so we have to start with the language of pain because when we talk about a patient's experience, the definition is, well, it's non-negotiable, right?
Exactly. Pain is formally defined as an unpleasant sensory and emotional experience.
And the sources stress that fundamental clinical principle, pain is whatever the patient says it is.
And it exists whenever they say it does.
Yeah.
That subjectivity is key.
So the first way we classify that experience is by duration.
That's right. We look at acute pain. Its sudden onset usually subsides pretty quickly once the underlying cause is treated. Generally lasts less than 6 weeks.
Okay.
Then you contrast that with persistent pain, sometimes called chronic pain. That's recurring or constant, lasting longer than 3 to 6 months.
And that often requires a far more complex approach.
Oh, definitely. A multidisciplinary approach,
Yeah.
usually.
Okay, here's where it gets interesting. Distinguishing between the physical capacity for pain and the psychological ability to handle it. So what's the difference between threshold and tolerance?
Right. Think of it this way. Pain threshold is like the hardware. It's the physiological level of stimulus needed to actually produce a painful sensation.
And that's pretty similar for most people.
Remarkably similar, yeah. But pain tolerance, that's more like the software.
Okay.
Is the amount of pain a patient can endure without it interfering with their daily life. And that tolerance is highly variable.
Influenced by things like rest or anxiety.
Huge factors. Rest, empathy, medication can raise it. Anxiety, sleeplessness, anger can lower it dramatically. That psychological variability is the critical challenge in managing persistent pain.
Makes sense. Now let's talk biology. Nociception. This is the mechanism, the pathway from injury to feeling pain in the brain.
It all starts with the nociceptors, the sensory nerve fibers that transmit those signals.
And the sources break this journey down into 4 steps.
4 distinct sequential processes. First up is transduction.
Okay.
This is where the initial stimuli, mechanical, thermal, chemical, like a cut or inflammation, get converted into electrical energy, action potentials.
And chemicals like prostaglandins are involved here.
Yes, exactly. Which is critical because many common pain meds, like NSAIDs, work right there by altering those substances.
Got it. So that's the stimulus registering. Step 2 is transmission.
Right. The electrical impulse travels along the nerve fibers up to the spinal cord, and this is where the famous gate control theory really comes into play.
The gates in the spinal cord.
Yeah, located in the dorsal horn. The sources describe them as regulating whether that impulse continues up to the brain.
And the impulse travels along 2 types of fibers, right? Do they compete or signal different pain types?
Kind of both. You have the large diameter A delta fibers. They transmit that faster, sharp initial pain.
Okay.
And importantly, activating these A delta fibers can actually close the gate, inhibiting transmission.
And the other type?
Those are the smaller C fibers. They transmit the slower, dull, aching, poorly localized persistent pain, and they open the gate.
So if rubbing an injury activates the large A delta fibers, it forces the gate closed against the C fibers. Is that why rubbing helps? Or things like 10S units?
Precisely. You're activating those larger fibers to inhibit the transmission from the smaller, chronic pain signal fibers. It reduces the sensation of pain perceived by the brain.
Very clever. That brings us to step 3, perception, the subjective experience.
Feeling it in the cerebral cortex, yeah. And finally, step 4 is modulation.
The body's own pain control.
Exactly. It's built-in descending system. Neurons from the brainstem release our natural painkillers, endorphins, and enkephalins.
And they work how?
These endogenous neurotransmitters bind to our opioid receptors and inhibit pain transmission by essentially slamming those spinal cord gates shut from the top down.
So if the body's natural modulation is so powerful, how do our pharmacological heavy hitters like opioids interact with this? Do they mimic it or overwhelm it?
That's the perfect transition. Let's talk opioid analgesics.
Okay.
So opioids are derived either from the opium poppy, those are opiates like morphine, or they're fully synthetic. Their power comes from binding to specific receptors, mainly the mu, kappa, and delta receptors.
Starting with agonists.
Right. Agonists bind to these receptors and cause an analgesic response. Morphine is the classic strong activist prototype. We also have fentanyl, codeine, which is milder.
And for patients needing maybe a lower risk tool, perhaps due to addiction history?
That's where the agonist-antagonist or partial agonists come in.
Yeah.
They bind, but cause a weaker response than a full agonist.
Weaker response.
Yeah, and clinically, they're associated with an analgesic ceiling effect, meaning beyond a certain dose, you don't get any more pain relief.
So less risk.
Lower risk of misuse, yeah. Makes them useful in certain situations, like obstetrics, or for patients with a history of opioid issues.
And then the crucial rescue drugs, the antagonists.
Essential. These are drugs like naloxone and naltrexone. They're competitive antagonists. They bind tightly to the receptors but cause no response.
So they kick the agonists off.
Effectively, yes, reversing the effects of the agonists. Vital in overdose situations.
Now, the sources flag some serious hazards here. Let's talk potency differences. What's critical for practitioners to know?
This concept is equianalgesia, the relative potency. Misunderstanding this is directly linked to patient harm, serious harm.
Okay, like what?
You absolutely must know that hydromorphone is 5 to 8 times more potent than morphine.
5 to 8 times.
Yes. Lack of awareness of this difference when switching drugs or calculating doses has tragically been linked to severe adverse outcomes, including reported deaths. It's a huge safety issue.
Wow. Okay. Another drug flagged for extreme caution is meperidine. Why is that one restricted so often?
It's because of its neurotoxic metabolite, normoperidine. It builds up because it's eliminated slowly.
And that metabolite causes?
Neurotoxicity, seizures, delirium. Particularly risky in older adults or those with kidney problems. And crucially, this specific neurotoxicity is not reversed by naloxone.
Not reversed by naloxone. That makes it incredibly dangerous for long-term use then.
Exactly. Very restricted now.
What about fentanyl transdermal patches? They offer long-term relief, but the nursing considerations seem like strict safety mandates.
Oh, they are critical. Absolutely critical. Fentanyl patches are only for opioid-tolerant patients with stable chronic pain. Never for acute pain, never for opioid-naive patients.
Okay. And the big rules.
2 absolute rules.
Okay.
First, do not cut the patch.
Yeah.
Ever. It destroys the controlled release mechanism.
Okay.
Second, avoid heat. No heating pads directly on it, no saunas, even prolonged sun exposure. Heat increases local blood flow.
And accelerates absorption.
Dramatically.
Yeah.
Can lead directly to a fatal overdose. It's that serious.
Given that opioids profoundly depress the central nervous system, let's talk about the primary hazard everyone worries about.
That has to be the most serious adverse effect. CNS depression leading directly to respiratory depression.
That's the main cause of death in overdose.
Almost always. Respiratory arrest. Other common side effects, while less acutely dangerous, are still major issues. GI problems like constipation, often very persistent nausea, vomiting.
And CNS effects too.
Yeah. Sedation, euphoria sometimes, and things like urinary retention can also happen. Cardiovascular effects like low blood pressure, flushing due to histamine release.
Okay, so given respiratory depression is the #1 danger, let's focus on the essential countermeasure, naloxone.
Naloxone. Absolutely the drug of choice for reversal. As a competitive antagonist, it binds quickly and occupies those receptor sites, displacing the opioid.
And the take-home kits in Canada have made a difference.
Huge difference. Instrumental in reversing countless community overdoses. A major public health success.
But managing an overdose in a clinical setting isn't just about injecting naloxone, right? There are timing and titration issues.
That's a really important point. The reversal needs very careful titration. If you give too much too fast,
You trigger withdrawal.
immediate and severe opioid withdrawal, which is incredibly distressing for the patient. Plus, naloxone has a very short half-life, maybe 30 to 90 minutes, tops.
Which is a problem for long-acting opioids.
Exactly. Think about methadone. Its half-life is 24 to 36 hours. The naloxone can wear off long before the methadone does.
Meaning the respiratory depression can come back.
Precisely. You might need repeat dosing, sometimes even a continuous infusion in severe cases, especially for things like methadone or extended release formulations.
Speaking of methadone, it seems a bit unique among the full agonists.
It is unique. One key reason is its elimination primarily through the liver, not the kidneys as much as some others.
So it's safer for patients with kidney problems.
Potentially safer, yes, for chronic pain or in detoxification programs, especially if there's concurrent kidney impairment where other opioids might build up to toxic levels much faster.
Okay, let's shift gears now to non-opioid options for milder pain. starting with acetaminophen or Tylenol, probably the most widely used analgesic out there.
Oh, definitely. Acetaminophen works by blocking peripheral pain impulses, inhibiting prostaglandin synthesis. Similar in a way to NSAIDs, but different location.
And it reduces fever.
Yes, acts directly on the hypothalamus for fever. But here's the crucial difference you must remember. Acetaminophen lacks significant anti-inflammatory effects.
Unlike NSAIDs.
Exactly. It's a pain reliever, a fever reducer, but not an anti-inflammatory. Big distinction.
It's available over the counter, which paradoxically makes the toxicity profile even more concerning. What's the major acute risk?
Hepatotoxicity, liver necrosis. This is non-negotiable knowledge.
Maximum dose.
Standard maximum daily dose for healthy adults is 4,000 milligrams. But, and this is but if a patient drinks alcohol concurrently,
The risk increases.
dramatically,
Yeah.
the toxic threshold plummets.
Hmm.
The maximum daily dose should then be limited to 2,000 milligrams.
And it's often hidden in combo products?
Yes. Cough and cold remedies. Patients might not even realize they're doubling up. Very easy to accidentally overdose.
And if toxicity does occur, there's that notoriously difficult antidote.
Acetylcysteine.
Yeah.
Yes. It works by preventing those toxic metabolites from forming in the liver.
But administering it.
It's a challenge. You're fighting time, the patient is often nauseous, and you need them to swallow something that smells and tastes, frankly, like rotten eggs.
It sounds awful.
Often requires masking with juice or soda, sometimes even IV administration if they can't tolerate the oral dose. It's tough, but life-saving.
Okay. We also have miscellaneous analgesics, like tramadol. You mentioned it has a unique double mechanism.
Yeah, tramadol is interesting. It's a weak mu-opioid receptor binder, and it inhibits the reuptake of norepinephrine and serotonin, more like some antidepressants.
That dual action sounds like it might carry specific risks.
It does. Specifically, the potential for seizures is a known risk.
Mhm.
And serotonin syndrome, especially if the patient is already taking SSRIs or other drugs that affect serotonin levels, need to be cautious with combinations.
Good point. Finally, for localized pain, the source mentions transdermal lidocaine.
Right, this is a topical anesthetic patch, often used for nerve pain, like after shingles that post-therapeutic neuralgia.
It acts locally, but there's a key nursing point about wear time.
Absolutely critical. Patches should only be worn for a maximum of 12 hours per day, then off for 12 hours,
Why the break?
to prevent systemic absorption of the lidocaine. Too much systemically can cause cardiotoxicity, specifically cardiac dysrhythmias. So 12 on, 12 off.
Got it. So, wrapping things up, let's circle back to the nursing process. It frames everything. We now treat pain as the fifth vital sign.
Which represents a massive and positive shift in healthcare. Pain assessment is now systemic, routine.
And historically, guidance came from the WHO ladder.
Often, yes. The three-step WHO analgesic ladder. Start with non-opioids, then add mild opioids, then strong opioids, all potentially with or without adjuvants. Though it's maybe a bit simplistic for some complex pain today. Modern approaches are more flexible.
You mentioned adjuvants. What are adjuvant analgesic drugs, and why are they so important now?
They're drugs added to the primary pain regimen, not typically thought of as analgesics themselves, but they provide synergistic effects. Think antidepressants, anticonvulsants, corticosteroids.
And the goal is?
By adding them, we can often reduce the required opioid dose. This helps minimize those severe opioid side effects, like respiratory depression and constipation, while still achieving good pain control.
Any key examples?
Definitely. Anticonvulsants like gabapentin and pregabalin, and certain antidepressants like amitriptyline. These are often uniquely effective for managing neuropathic pain, nerve pain, which opioids alone frequently don't touch very well.
Right. In terms of assessment itself, how do we make sure we get an accurate measure of something so subjective?
You have to use validated, age-appropriate tools. For most adults, the numeric pain intensity scale, the 0 to 10 scale, is standard.
And for kids or nonverbal patients?
For children aged 3 and up, or adults with cognitive impairment, the FACES pain rating scale is often recommended. It uses simple pictures of faces showing different levels of pain, which helps overcome verbal barriers.
Makes sense. Now, when administering these drugs for chronic or persistent pain, there's a vital rule about scheduling.
Absolutely crucial. For persistent pain, drugs must be administered around-the-clock scheduled dosing rather than just relying on as diet or prawn orders.
Why is that so important?
Scheduled dosing maintains steady-state drug levels in the body. It prevents those painful troughs where the drug wears off and the pain escalates sharply. Once pain escalates, it's much harder to get back under control. Proactive, scheduled dosing is key for persistent pain.
Okay. Finally, let's connect this to special populations. Children and older adults have unique safety concerns, often linked to metabolism.
Very true. Children, historically, have often been undermedicated, partly due to fear of side effects. Doses must always be calculated accurately based on weight, sometimes height or body surface area.
And there's a specific warning about codeine.
Yes, Health Canada is very clear on this.
Yeah.
Because of the genetic variability in metabolism, the risk of being an ultra-rapid metabolizer and converting codeine to morphine too quickly, codeine and products containing it, must not be used in anyone under 18.
Not at all. Wow.
Not recommended. Too unpredictable, too risky.
And for older adults, what's the approach?
The clinical mantra is really start low, go slow.
Meaning?
Older adults often have age-related decline in kidney and liver function, slowing down drug metabolism and excretion. This increases their sensitivity to all CNS depressants, including opioids.
So smaller doses.
Smaller initial doses, slower titration upwards, and very frequent monitoring. They're at a much higher risk for falls, confusion, constipation, and accidental toxicity. Vigilance is key. So ultimately, what the sources really drive home is that effective pain management demands a holistic approach. It needs to be individualized, constantly reassessed.
A balancing act.
Absolutely. Balancing pharmacological effectiveness with constant vigilance against those serious adverse effects, especially respiratory depression and, with drugs like acetaminophen, hepatic toxicity.
That really is the essential balance, and maybe here's a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to consider as you encounter these situations clinically.
Okay.
Even when you're treating patients who might be opioid tolerant or who have a documented history of addiction, the sources emphasize that the clinical and ethical priority must always be adequate pain control.
That's right. Untreated pain itself can be a huge stressor.
And the careful, considered use of maybe long-acting opioids, perhaps agonist antagonists, and definitely adjuvant therapies, allows this critical balance, treating pain effectively while maintaining safety, to be achieved humanely and responsibly.
Well said. It's complex, but achievable with knowledge and care.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into analgesic drugs.